Folks, welcome. Billy Peebles, the headmaster here at Lovett, and we're delighted you're here tonight. One housekeeping detail before I talk briefly about this lecture series and then introduce Dr. Gallagher. There's a sheet that we're asking folks to complete. Some of you may have picked it up, or maybe pick it up as you leave a little bit later in the evening. It'll give us some helpful information in planning future lectures. We plan to continue with this series through the culmination of the sesquicentennial in 2015, and trying to have these things at times during the week and times during the day that make sense for the greatest number of people. So if you have a moment to complete that, we'd be grateful to you. It's a privilege to have all of you here in our Hendricks Chenault Theater to hear Dr. Gary Gallagher of the University of Virginia. Before I formally introduce him, I want to thank our planning committee for this Civil War and the Forging of Character lecture series. Lots and lots of people have worked diligently to make this speaker series possible, including trustees, Lovett trustees Bob Glenn and Hampton Morris, our communications director Kim Blass, our chief advancement officer Andy Spencer, Lovett parent Amanda Glenn Brady, and Gordon Jones, who's here tonight, the senior military historian at the Atlanta History Center. Gordon and Sheffield Hale, the CEO there, and his colleagues at the History Center have just been fabulous partners in putting this series together. Where is Gordon? He's here somewhere. Thank you, sir. We were in your debt. Gary Gallagher told me this morning that there's nobody better at what he does than Gordon Jones, and so that's pretty high praise, sir. I want to also thank Sandy Riddell, our Director of Community Relations, and also the folks who make this theater run. Katie Keogh is a Lovett alum who's working here in the Hendricks Chenault Theater, and she's providing all the background technical support for tonight. And of course, there's the Ann and Jack Glenn Foundation and their sons, Austin, Bob, Jack, and Louis Glenn. So grateful to them for creating the Glenn Character Endowment Fund, which provides the resources that make possible the two talks today that Dr. Gallagher will have given here by the end of the evening. Three of the Glenn brothers are here. If you'll please stand and accept our thanks. Austin is here. Bob and Louis, I think, are going to stand up. So grateful to the Glenn brothers for the incredible generosity they bestow upon Lovett. It's an honor to have in our midst and to introduce Gary Gallagher, the John L. Now III Professor in the History of the American Civil War at the University of Virginia. Dr. Gallagher hails originally from Los Angeles, California. He earned his BA from Adams State College in Colorado and his MA and PhD, respectively, from the University of Texas at Austin. He subsequently taught for 12 years at Penn State before coming to the University of Virginia in 1998. He is the author or editor of more than 30 books, including 2 books, The Confederate War and the Union War, both published by Harvard University Press, and which are available for sale in the theater if we haven't already sold out in the theater foyer following this lecture. He's the editor of 2 book series at the University of North Carolina Press, Civil War America and Military Campaigns of the Civil War. He appears regularly on the Arts and Entertainment Network series called Civil War Journal, and has participated in some 40 other television projects in these fields. He's delivered numerous lectures about the Civil War at several universities across the country. 10 years ago, he was the Times Mirror Foundation Distinguished Fellow at the Henry E. Huntington Library in San Marino, California. 2 years ago, he received the highest, that's the highest teaching award that can be bestowed upon a professor at the University of Virginia, the Cavaliers Distinguished Teaching Professorship. He's intimately involved with the preservation of Civil War sites, has served as a member of the board of the Civil War Trust, and has appeared before congressional committees on many occasions to provide expert testimony about the importance of preserving Civil War sites. One writer and historian calls Gary Gallagher the most astute and provocative writer on the American Civil War. I don't pretend to be an expert on Dr. Gallagher's scholarship. I will tell you that he gave a stunning lecture to our American Studies students and other Lovett students and a number of guests this morning on the causes of the Civil War. It was just stellar. I have read some of his work, and what really grabs my heart, if you will, is the depth of his research, his passion for his topic, his very clear and compact writing style, and his great admiration for the truly extraordinary sacrifices people on both sides of this epic national battle were willing to make in service to their cause. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gary Gallagher to the lecture.
Thank you very much, Billy. This seems familiar. I was here not long ago and had fun this morning I thought I was going to come this morning and talk to a class. And instead I came and talked to a whole room full of students, which was more fun, and we had some nice give and take afterward, which I hope we will also have tonight. I may say some things that upset some people and some things that don't, but either way it should be fun to talk about it afterward. What my subject is R.E. Lee and the question of loyalty. I think it's often presented within a Civil War context as people were either loyal to their states or they were loyal to the United States, and at some point they had to make a choice. What I want to do tonight is complicate that a little bit. I think that is a far too simplistic way to look at loyalty during the Civil War era. I think people had multiple loyalties, and I'm going to use R.E. Lee as a way to get at that notion tonight. I'm not going to talk for a very long time, 30 or 35 minutes, and then we can start the fun after that. I think there are very few historical figures who are so closely associated with their native state as R.E. Lee. His decision to resign from the United States Army and cast his lot first with Virginia and then with the Confederacy has inspired extensive discussion. Charles Francis Adams, Jr., whose family rivaled the Lees as a force in American history and who was a junior officer in the Army of the Potomac and fought against Lee during the Civil War, fought against the Army in Northern Virginia, addressed the topic of Lee and loyalty in a lecture titled, "Shall Cromwell Have a Statue?" He spoke at the University of Chicago in 1902, and Adams sketched Lee as a man with powerful familial and emotional ties to the Old Dominion. Of him it might and injustice must be said, averred Adams, that he was more than the essence, he was the quintessence of Virginia. The most influential writer on the topic has been Douglas Southall Freeman, whose 4-volume Pulitzer Prize-winning biography remains by far the fullest reckoning of Lee's life. I read Freeman as a little boy growing up in southern Colorado. I read Lee's Lieutenants and I read R.E. Lee. My grandmother gave both sets to me, one when I was 11 and one when I was 12. And Freeman is to a significant degree responsible for my interest in the Civil War. I was captivated by him and later by Bruce Catton, but Freeman was absolutely central to my interests. And the Lee that Freeman presented was a Virginian. A self-proclaimed proud Virginian himself, Freeman described Lee's decision to resign his commission in the United States Army. He described that in a chapter he titled, "The Answer He Was Born to Make." The rapid approach of war, wrote Freeman, had quickly and inexorably revealed which were the deepest loyalties of his soul. Anyone seeking to understand Lee, believed Freeman, need know only that Virginia always remained paramount in his thinking. Freeman reproduced the entire text of Lee's letter to General-in-Chief Winfield Scott, dated April 20th, 1861, that announced Lee's resignation after all those years in the United States Army, a letter that included one of the most frequently quoted sentences that Lee ever penned or spoke. Quote, "Save in the defense of my native state, I never desire again to draw my sword." That's been quoted endlessly through the years. This idea that Lee's Virginia identity holds the key to understanding his life and career retains great vitality. And I promise I'm not going to just start listing books that say this and read 20 or 30 of them to you to make my point. But I am going to quote from 3. One is from Terry Jones's recent 700-page single-volume history titled The American Civil War, came out in 2010. It observes a quote, although he loved the Union and opposed secession, Lee's greatest loyalty was to Virginia. David Goldfield's America Aflame, How the Civil War Created a Nation, which came out last year, takes a similar tack. His fealty to his native state of Virginia, writes Goldfield, superseded his loyalty to the Union. And the most widely read single volume on the Civil War of the past 2 decades, Jim McPherson's Battle Cry of Freedom, also describes Lee's decision to leave federal service after Virginia's secession as, quote, foreordained by birth and blood. There's also a literature that presents Lee as above all a Virginian, a literature very critical of Lee as a general that grew up in the mid-70s and continued until the mid-90s. A literature that argued that Lee was prevented from becoming a great Confederate soldier because he couldn't even appreciate what was happening beyond the Appalachians. All he could see was Virginia. Every decision he made was based on what was happening in Virginia. He had a view of the West sort of like New Yorkers have of everything west of the Hudson River. The New Yorkers, look, everything's in sharp detail till you get to the Hudson. Yeah, there's 8th Avenue, 2nd Avenue, they're all there. Beyond the Hudson, it's just sort of hazy. And way off in the distance, there's something. We think it's LA, but we're not sure. They say that's how Lee looked at the landscape of the Civil War. Virginia's in sharp relief beyond the Appalachians. He doesn't even really know what's going on. Well, you can reach that conclusion only in one way, and that's if you don't read anything that Lee wrote, which is sort of liberating. You're free to reach any conclusion you want. If you don't read anything or know anything, you might as well be a novelist. But you can argue that about R.E. Lee, which many have. I'll just quote from one, Thomas L. Conley, who was very prominent among those who questioned Lee's contributions to the Confederate military effort, who portrayed Lee as a man blind to the conflict's larger strategic landscape. His concept of the war effort was almost totally identified with Virginia, claimed Conley in his book The Marble Man, which came out in 1977, and he felt that other theaters were secondary to the Eastern Front. Again, he's a Virginian. He's a Virginian, and that guides everything that he does. Lee, the parochial Virginian, also appears in the realm of popular culture. 2 films directed by Ron Maxwell include scenes that highlight the importance of Virginia to Lee's actions and attitudes. In Gettysburg, which came out in 1993, that's the translation to film of Michael Shar's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, The Killer Angels. And not bad as Civil War movies go. As you all know, most Civil War movies are so wretched it hurts to watch them. This is not that bad. It's better than that. But it has Lee and Longstreet in one scene talking and discussing their loyalties. It's the morning of July the 2nd, 1863, and they're on Seminary Ridge and they're talking about what is important to them. And James Longstreet says what's important to him, his loyalty lies with his state and with his family. And Robert E. Lee agrees. Neither one of them even mentions the Confederacy as something that is important in their range of loyalties. Gods and Generals, which came out in 2003, makes the same point, only much more forcefully in a scene just prior to the Battle of Fredericksburg in December 1862. It has Lee looking across the Rappahannock over toward Ferry Farm, George Washington's birthplace, on the left bank of the Rappahannock there, just opposite Fredericksburg. And Robert Duvall, who is Lee in that film, he's too old to be Lee, but he's Lee in that film. Neither film gets Lee right, but never mind, it's Hollywood, who cares? Robert Duvall looks across the river and says, there's something about these Yankees, they don't understand, they never will understand. You see these rivers and valleys and streams, fields, towns even, and the emotion rises in his voice. They're just markings on a map to those people in the War Office in Washington. But for Lee and Confederates, it becomes clear they're birthplaces and burial grounds and battlefields where their ancestors fought. They are the incarnation of all our memories and all that we are, says Lee, and then repeats again, all that we are. In an interview about the films, Maxwell explained his interpretation of Lee and Stonewall Jackson. He said, I'm simply presenting the truth. Virginia was their home. They would fight for their home. I believe it's a serious distortion, as you might have surmised already, to approach Lee as a figure best understood as someone always motivated by his sense of being a Virginian, a man whose principal identity always was as a Virginian. I'll spend the balance of my time this evening looking at 4 loyalties that Lee had. As I said earlier, I'm going to look at his loyalty to Virginia, his loyalty to the United States, his loyalty to the slaveholding South, and his loyalty to the Confederacy, and try to put them in conversation with one another and show how they led, reinforced, and helped explain a much more complicated view of Lee and his range of loyalties. I'm going to take my analytical cue here from a historian named David M. Potter, who I think is one of the great historians of the United States ever. If you've never read anything by David M. Potter, you should go get something and read it by him, because everything he ever wrote is worth reading. And a good place to start, it's a big fat book, but a good place to start would be a book called The Impending Crisis that looks at the period between the war with Mexico and the Civil War. He belongs on any short shelf of the most perceptive interpreters of United States history, and especially of the 19th century. He wrote an essay called The Historian's Use of Nationalism and Vice Versa, a terrible title, but a very useful essay. And that essay reminds us that every human being, all of us, possess a range of loyalties, very complicated range of loyalties, and different ones of those loyalties at different moments become the most important. They percolate up and they drop down in terms of inspiring us to do this or not do that, or not to do anything at all. In Lee's case, as I said, I'm going to discuss these 4 levels that became more prominent, receded, or intertwined at crucial periods in his life. And I'll begin with Virginia, which certainly loomed largest during the momentous spring of 1861. And I'll chronicle in abbreviated fashion Lee's road to resignation from the United States Army. He was stationed out in Texas as the very difficult secession winter of 1860-61 came. He was lieutenant colonel, and he watched the Union that he'd served for more than 30 years drift toward disaster while he was busy with duty out in Texas that he detested, chasing Comanches whom he never caught, serving on courts-martial, which he found tedious beyond belief, and suffering what in the mid-19th century was a Texas climate that would not be the most inviting that you might ever imagine. I lived in Texas 13 years. It gets hot in Texas. It really does. And then it stays hot. And Lee talked about that. The election of Abraham Lincoln triggered South Carolina's secession on December 20th, 1860, as everyone in this room knows. And in rapid order, 6 more Deep South states followed, so that by February 1st, the entire tier of the Lower South, of the Deep South, the Cotton South, had left the Union, including Texas, which was last and left on February 1st, 1861. Shortly after Texas seceded, Lee received orders to report to Winfield Scott in Washington, D.C. He had a sad parting with friends in San Antonio. He had good friends in San Antonio, and then began his long journey home. He reached Arlington on March the 1st. The national crisis deepened soon after Lee's return to Virginia. Jefferson Davis headed the new Confederate government in Montgomery, Alabama, and tensions escalated regarding the fate of Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. There had already been a tense moment, as you know, at Charleston back in January, when South Carolinians fired on the Star of the West, a Union vessel that sailed into the harbor. But James Buchanan had hunkered down. Nothing had happened then, but now it was in the news again. Fort Sumter and Charleston. In early March, Lee met privately for several hours with Winfield Scott. He was a protege of Scott's. Scott much admired Lee's service in Mexico, considered him the best soldier in the United States Army, as he said more than once. He didn't mean that. Scott thought he was the best soldier in the United States Army, and he knew everybody knew that, so he would say Lee was, and everybody would understand he thought Lee was the 2nd best soldier in the United States Army. During that interview, it's almost certain that Winfield Scott urged Lee to remain in the United States Army no matter what happened regarding Virginia. Lee's promotion to colonel of the 1st United States Cavalry Regiment followed on March 16th. Jefferson Davis had created 2 elite cavalry regiments as Secretary of War in the 1850s, and Lee was offered command of one of those. In the meantime, Confederate Secretary of War Leroy Pope Walker offered Lee a brigadier generalship in the Confederate Army. Walker's letter, dated March 15th, reached Lee after word of Lee's promotion to colonel of the 1st Cavalry. Lee apparently never responded to Walker's letter. At least there's no record of it. But on March 30th, he accepted the promotion in the United States Army. And so he's a colonel at the end of March 1861, and his command will be the 1st Cavalry. The final storm broke in mid-April, as you know. Confederates fired on Fort Sumter on the 12th. The Federal garrison formally surrendered on the 14th, and Lincoln issued a call for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion on April 15th. And that is the great moment in terms of settling the fate of the Upper South. It's not the firing on Fort Sumter, it's the call for volunteers to suppress the rebellion. That's what sends the Upper South out. Tennessee and Virginia and North Carolina and Arkansas. Arkansas matters, just not as much as the others. Apologies to anyone from Arkansas here. On April 17th, Lee received requests for 2 meetings, to meet separately with Winfield Scott again and with Francis Preston Blair Sr. Blair was the patriarch of a very well-connected and powerful Democratic family. He'd been part of Andrew Jackson's kitchen cabinet. They were very well connected. 2 of his sons would play key roles in the American Civil War. Frank Blair, Francis Preston Blair Jr., and Montgomery Blair, who would be in Lincoln's cabinet. Lincoln and the Secretary of War, Simon Cameron, had asked the elder Blair to talk with R.E. Lee. Both meetings took place on the morning of the 18th. Empowered by Lincoln to, quote, ascertain Lee's intentions and feelings, and by Secretary of War Cameron to make an offer to Lee, command of the Union Army making up outside Washington that would be used to suppress the rebellion. That's the background for the meeting with the senior Blair. Blair asked Lee to take that command. Among the arguments he deployed, Blair observed that the people of the United States looked to Lee, quote, as a representative of the Washington family, an allusion to Lee's marriage to Marianna Randolph Custis, the daughter of George Washington's step-grandson. He knew that would resonate with Lee because he knew that Lee's own idol, the person Lee admired above all others, was George Washington, and that his connection to Washington and the Washington relics through marriage into the Custis family had always been very important to Lee. But Lee declined Blair's offer and proceeded immediately to Scott's office, where he recounted his conversation with Blair and reiterated that he would not accept the proffered command. Tradition has it that Scott, who was from Dinwiddie County, Virginia, replied, quote, Lee, you've made the greatest mistake of your life, but I feared it would be so. Sounds good. We don't know whether he really said that or not. Powerful emotions must have pulled at Lee as he pondered his future that evening and the next day. Word of Virginia's secession appeared in local newspapers on April 19th. April 19th, and in the early morning hours of April 20, Lee composed a 1-sentence letter of resignation to Simon Cameron. Later that day, he wrote a much longer letter to Winfield Scott, noting that he would have resigned immediately, quote, but for the struggle it has cost me to separate myself from a service to which I have devoted all the best years of my life and all the ability I possessed. The penultimate sentence of that letter to Scott contained the already quoted statement regarding raising his sword only in defense of Virginia. The War Department took 5 days to process Lee's resignation, which became official on April 25th. By then, he had received an offer from Governor John Letcher to take command of all of Virginia's forces. The 54-year-old Lee traveled to Richmond on April 22nd, talked with Letcher, and accepted the offer of a major generalcy of Virginia state forces. Letcher immediately sent his name forward to the Virginia State Convention, which had just voted to secede, for confirmation, accompanied by a brief text explaining that Lee had resigned his commission in the United States Army before being aware that a commission would be in the offing from Virginia. In other words, making it clear that Lee wasn't doing all of this at the same time. There was a sequence to it, a sequence that he thought was important and Lee would have as well. On April 23rd, Lee accompanied a 4-person delegation to the Virginia Capitol in Richmond. A few minutes after noon, they entered the building where the convention's members were in private session. As he waited outside the closed room, you can still walk into that room today. It's a very evocative place. And right outside it today, as when R.E. Lee waited outside that meeting room, is the statue of George Washington, the very famous statue of George Washington by Jean-Antoine Houdon. It's just Washington, a full-size statue of Washington in his military gear. There is Lee, face to face with his military and civilian model, really. It's Washington both as a soldier and Washington as a small R Republican citizen who was deeply important to R.E. Lee as someone who showed what impeccable behavior and performance looked like in a democratic republic. He soon entered the crowded chamber and he listened to welcoming remarks from John Janey, a former Whig and the convention's president. Like a majority of the delegates in the convention, Janey had been a Unionist. He'd voted against secession until the very end. Virginia was not on the verge of secession until Lincoln's call for the 75,000 volunteers. Janey said it was a unanimous vote to appoint Lee, and then he quoted Lee's father, Light Horse Harry Lee, who had authored the most memorable tribute to George Washington, first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen. That's Light Horse Harry Lee, eulogizing George Washington. And Janey turned to that. He said, "We pray God most fervently that you may so conduct the operations committed to your charge that it will soon be said of you that you are first in peace. And when that time comes, you will have earned the still prouder distinction of being first in the hearts of your countrymen." The tribute from Janey surely made Lee uncomfortable. Lee never wrote about it, but I'm sure he did not like being compared to Washington, especially the suggestion that he would become the Confederacy's Washington. I think few, if any, in that chamber really could have imagined that in 4 years, that's precisely what was going to happen. That is exactly what happened with R.E. Lee and the Confederate nation. He and his army became, to the Confederate attempt to establish their nationhood, almost exactly what George Washington and the Continental Army had been during the American Revolution. And that is the most important national institution, the most important rallying point, the point to which people looked to determine whether their effort to establish their nation still had a chance to succeed. Much more important than Jefferson Davis and the Confederate Congress, just as Washington and the Continental Army had been more important than the Continental Congress. Where is the Continental Congress? Who the hell knows? They used to be in Philadelphia. Then they went somewhere else in Pennsylvania. I don't know where they are, but where is Washington? That's the key. And that's what happens. It's not by accident that Appomattox marks the end of the American Civil War. It marks the end of the American Civil War because it's the end of the Army in Northern Virginia. There are still scores of thousands of Confederate soldiers under arms at many other places in the Confederacy, and it doesn't matter. Because they're not commanded by R.E. Lee. They're commanded by Joseph Eggleston Johnston and others, from whom much less was expected than from Lee. I know there are secret Johnston admirers in this room. I do. You're everywhere. Not many of you, but you're there. I know you have a secret handshake. You get upset when people say Lee was more important than Johnston. It's like saying an elephant's bigger than a gnat. It should be obvious to everyone. Joe Johnston's all right. Barely. He becomes what Washington had been. And it's an overt comparison for Confederates. It's not something that maybe people are thinking. They say it again and again and again and again. They compare Washington to Lee. And they often compare Lee favorably to Washington, in fact. Quite remarkable. Anyway, John Janey did that as Lee stood there and listened, and I think was uncomfortable. After Janey finished, Lee offered a two-sentence acceptance, and he closed with this, quote, "I will devote myself to the defense and service of my native state, in whose behalf alone would I have ever drawn my sword." The same sentiment as the letter to Winfield Scott. He said the same thing. He wrote lots of letters at the same time, and the language is it's like when we send 10 emails on the same subject in one day. They're all pretty much the same. Lee had these sentiments in many letters from the time. Lee the Virginian certainly held center stage in this dramatic moment of his life. There's no question about that. In a letter to his sister, Anne Lee Marshall, he explained, quote, "I've not been able to make up my mind to raise my hand against my relatives, my children, my home." But in fact, many members of Lee's extended family were staunch Unionists, including his sister, Anne Marshall, and many cousins, several of whom fought for the United States during the war, a number of whom never spoke to Robert E. Lee again after his decision in the spring of 1861. Within his own household, Mary Ann Custis, Lee, and most of their children were quite Unionist in their sympathies. His sons made their decisions later than Robert E. Lee did. Two of them became Confederate generals, as you know. Rooney Lee became a general, Custis Lee became a general, but they decided later. Only his daughter Mary fully embraced her father's decision. Moreover, more than a third of all Virginians who had graduated from West Point remained loyal to the United States. We often have a sense that there are really only two Virginians who stay loyal to the United States. George H. Thomas, it's one of the most famous, and of course Winfield Scott. But in fact, a third of all the Virginia men who had commissions in the United States Army in 1861 kept their United States Army uniforms on. The point being that for many Virginians, including some very close to Lee, severing long-held ties to the United States was not the only honorable course they could take. You often read that Lee did the only thing he could do, the only thing that a Virginian could do was go with Virginia and then with the Confederacy. It's a decision that many people made. They didn't all reach the same conclusion that R.E. Lee did. But Virginia was important, and he's going to Virginia, not to the Confederacy. That's the thing to remember initially. But of course, very quickly, Virginia was in the Confederacy. He had about 6 weeks as Major General of Virginia forces. And then the Virginia forces go into the Confederate Army, and R.E. Lee goes into the Confederate Army, not as the ranking officer in the Confederate Army, but he does outrank Joseph Johnston, which Johnston never recovered from. Always keeping his eye on the really big issues, Johnston. He fumed about that for years. All right, the first level of loyalty. Now I want to move to the second, and that's the United States. What about R.E. Lee's loyalty to the United States? I think that loyalty certainly complicated his decision on April 20th. Indeed, much in his background pointed the way toward a different answer he was born to make in the spring of 1861. I'll say again, George Washington, the greatest of all Virginians and the greatest of all Americans in the view of the Civil War generation, and clearly, even for us, the most important of all American presidents. Without Washington, none of the rest probably happens. It's hard to make an argument for anybody being more important than George Washington in American history. It's really hard, extremely hard, and utterly unpersuasive if you try to. That man is R.E. Lee's idol. There would be no nation without George Washington. There would be no regular army without George Washington. There would be no sense of the whole transcending state and local interests without George Washington. And Washington was an ardent nationalist, as you know, always a nationalist in his view. He absolutely stood at the center of those who believed the nation must come first in that formative period. Lee came from a family of Federalists who believed in a strong nation and evinced little state-centered sentiment. In 1798, his father had opposed the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions with their strong support for state power authored by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Lighthorse Harry Lee argued that the Constitution, quote, was entirely the act of the people and not the state governments. Lighthorse Harry Lee's discussion of the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions anticipated Abraham Lincoln's argument that the origins of the Constitution and thus of the nation lay with we the people, not with we, the states. The language is almost identical. Lee had rendered staunch service to the Republic as a gifted engineer, as a staff officer who contributed substantively to United States victory in Mexico. He performed quite remarkably in Mexico, especially in the last phase of the campaign from Veracruz to Mexico City, overseen by Winfield Scott. He'd also been an imaginative superintendent at the United States Military Academy. Although Whiggish or even Federalist in his personal views, he applauded news of Democrat James Buchanan's election in 1856. Mr. Buchanan, it appears, is to be our next president. He wrote to Mrs. Lee in December of that year, "I hope he will be able to extinguish fanaticism north and south and cultivate love for the country and union and restore harmony between the different sections." Lee was equally hard on abolitionists, whom he considered fanatics on one end of the political spectrum, and fire eaters, whom he considered fanatics on the other end of the political spectrum. And that was a sentiment shared by many Americans. He opposed secession during the winter of 1860-61, and in a letter to his sister Anne, already quoted, described, quote, his devotion to the Union and, quote, feeling of loyalty and duty of an American citizen. His letter to Winfield Scott on April 20, that I've quoted from, also attested to his love of the Union. Earlier that year, in writing to his son Rooney, Rooney's his middle son, as you know, he echoed his Federalist father, insisting that the framers meant for the Union to be perpetual. "It is idle to talk of secession," wrote Lee bluntly. Turning to his professional model, as he often did, Lee lamented the possibility that Washington's, quote, noble deeds would be destroyed and that his precious advice and virtuous example so soon forgotten by his countrymen. Secession, for him, seemed to be a betrayal of George Washington and, by extension, of all the sacrifice of the soldiers who'd served in the Continental Army. Despite his clear affection for the Union, however, we know that Lee left its army, which brings us to a third level of loyalty, and that is his loyalty to the slaveholding South. This is the one of Lee's loyalties that receives the least attention, and yet I think it is absolutely central to his decision in the spring of 1861 to leave the United States Army. He strongly identified with the slave-holding South. That's a loyalty that's perfectly compatible with his loyalty to Virginia, of course. In letters and comments addressing his decision to resign from the Army, he often mentioned the South as well as Virginia. The focus is usually on what he says about Virginia, but he also talks about the South. His political philosophy stood strikingly at odds with the virulent rhetoric of secessionist fire eaters. However, as he wrote his son Custis before his resignation, that's his oldest son, the South, in my opinion, has been aggrieved by the acts of the North. I feel the aggression, and I'm willing to take every proper step for redress. In his meetings with Francis Preston Blair and Winfield Scott on April 18th, Lee proclaimed that while he opposed secession, quote, he would not take up arms against the South or against fellow Southerners. A desire to maintain racial control figured prominently in Lee's Southern identity. He's often presented as anti-slavery, somehow anti-slavery. He's not at all anti-slavery, and why would he be? He had very conventional views about race and slavery for someone of his time and class and place. Very much in the mainstream in his views. He accepted the peculiar institution as the best means for ordering relations between the races and resented Northerners who attacked the motives and character of slaveholders and seemed willing, or even in his view, eager to disrupt racial stability in the slaveholding states. In late December 1856, in a letter to his wife, he observed, quote, slavery as an institution is a moral and political evil in any country. That's often quoted. But he also believed the liberation of enslaved people should be left entirely in God's hands. Their emancipation will sooner result from the mild and melting influence of Christianity than the storms and tempests of fiery controversy. And he unequivocally denounced abolitionists, alluding to what he termed, quote, the systematic and progressive efforts of certain people of the North to interfere with and change the domestic institutions of the South. Domestic institutions of the South means the slavery-based social structure of the South. Such actions, he said, quote, can only be accomplished by them, abolitionists, through the agency of a civil and servile war. Lee's resentment of Northerners who would tamper with the South's racial order continued during the war. Although seldom quoted by historians, his response to Lincoln's final proclamation of emancipation leaves no doubt about the depth of his feeling. Emancipation Proclamation, the final version, was issued on January 1st, 1863, as you know. 9 days later, Lee wrote to the Confederate Secretary of War, James A. Seddon, calling for greater mobilization of human and material resources in the face of Union military power that threatened complete social disruption in the Confederacy. Lincoln's proclamation stood as, quote, a savage and brutal policy, stated Lee with barely controlled anger, which leaves us no alternative but success or degradation worse than death. If we would save the honor of our families from pollution, our social system from destruction. Lee is not a little bit upset about the Emancipation Proclamation. He is profoundly upset about the Emancipation Proclamation and the image that it raised of a possible disruption of social order. A great fear, as all of you know, of white Southerners before the Civil War was that something like Santo Domingo could happen in the South, a major slave rebellion that could be bloody and could sweep away the world as they knew it, and the Emancipation Proclamation raised those specters. Honor required this kind of response, said Lee. 2 years earlier, he'd also spoken of honor, claiming that, quote, there's no sacrifice I'm not ready to make for the preservation of the Union, save that of honor. As a member of the slaveholding aristocracy of Virginia and the South, his sense of honor dictated that he stand with those of his blood and his class and his section. He hated the idea of disunion, but rejected the idea of a country, as he put it, that can only be maintained by swords and bayonets, and he was unwilling to risk forced changes in a social structure predicated on the institution of slavery. That shouldn't come as a surprise to us, although it's not talked about that much. Let me move to the fourth level of loyalty here, and that's one that's forged during the most famous period of Lee's life and is, without doubt, the most important of his loyalties during, by far, the most important period of his life. And that period is the 4 years of the war, and that loyalty is to the Confederate nation. Lee is an ardent Confederate nationalist during the Civil War. There's some people who don't think there was such a thing as Confederate nationalism. They should read something that Robert E. Lee wrote. I don't just mean something, I mean basically anything that Robert E. Lee wrote. You could still argue there's no Confederate nationalism. You can also look at the sun and wonder why it's warm during the day here. But if you read Lee and read others like Lee, Confederate nationalism is not an elusive mystery. It's everywhere. His most important loyalty is to the Confederate nation, something perfectly consistent with his Southern and Virginia identities. His national viewpoint stands out vividly throughout his wartime correspondence, both his official correspondence and his correspondence with Mrs. Lee, and his correspondence with his sons, and his correspondence with others. From the opening of the conflict until the final scenes at Appomattox, he urged Confederate soldiers, Confederate politicians, Confederate civilians to set aside state and local interests entirely in pursuit of national success. If we don't achieve independence, was Lee's argument basically, none of your other loyalties matter. I don't care what you want for your state or your locality. If the Confederacy fails, you can wash all of those away. You're not going to have any of them. So your eyes should be on the ball. And the ball is waging an all-out war to achieve independence. The rest can come later. He articulated his views about the relative importance of state and national concerns on many occasions. He wrote to the Secretary of State of South Carolina in late December 1861, laying out his views very clearly. He's only 8 months into the war, but he was taking the long view regarding the topic of subordinating state to nation. The Confederate States have now but one great object in view, wrote Lee, the successful issue of war and independence. Everything worth their possessing depends on that. Everything should yield to its accomplishment. The Confederate people debated a number of issues relating to the expansion of national power. This always happens in wars. How much are you going to let the government do in order to win a war? Wars change things. Wars run far beyond what anybody can imagine. They put in place whole new sets of imperatives and possibilities. There's a whole literature now about how Abraham Lincoln can best be understood as someone whose main goal was to create a big central government that could bedevil people for the rest of American history. Well, here's a little flash for you. Lincoln didn't do anything that Jefferson Davis didn't do, and he didn't do nearly as much in many ways. The biggest, most intrusive central government in our history until deep into the 20th century is the Confederate government. And Robert E. Lee is right on board with that, because that's the kind of government he argued it's going to take to win this war. His attitude is basically, if it needs to be done for the war effort, do it. Do it. And do it now. Don't do it later. Do it now. It's one reason he and Jefferson Davis had such a good working relationship. They agreed on that. They're absolutely on the same page there. Absolutely on the same page. And I'm going to use three especially important examples of Lee's willingness to have the government get big and do whatever it took. One is conscription. Two is the impressment of goods and enslaved labor to support the Confederate war effort. And the third is arming some slaves to further the Confederate war effort. And please don't misread me here. I'm not about to say there were a bunch of black soldiers in the Confederate Army, because there weren't. There were not. This idea there are 50,000, 100,000. I've seen 100,000 is the largest number I've seen. 100,000 black Confederate soldiers. Really? Somebody should have told Robert E. Lee about them, because he would have wanted some of them. He didn't have any of them. That's a little aside. During the winter and spring of 1861-62, Lee instructed his aide, Charles Marshall, to, quote, draft a bill for raising an army by the direct agency of the Confederate government. Lee wanted the legislation, number one, to extend the service of men who had previously enlisted in good faith for 1 year. Number two, to place all other white males between the ages of 18 and 35 into Confederate service. And number three, to give Jefferson Davis the power, quote, to call out such parts of the population rendered liable to service by the law as he might deem proper and at such times as he might deem fit. Marshall aptly noted that, quote, this measure completely reversed the previous military legislation of the South. The efforts of the government had hitherto been confined to inviting the support of the people. General Lee thought it could more surely rely upon their intelligent obedience, and that it might safely assume command where it had as yet only tried to persuade. Now, Marshall's careful language softened the import of what Lee wanted. Lee wanted a Richmond government that could compel white, male, military-age citizens to serve in the Army. That had never happened in American history before. The United States government had never compelled men to serve. It could ask, I'm asking you to serve. And you say, how interesting that you ask, go straight to hell. Okay? And then I ask you, and eventually some people come, but had never forced men in. The United States is going to follow suit in a year. The Confederacy does it first because a huge percentage of their men had enlisted for 1 year in the spring of 1861. They are going to rotate out of service just as the campaigning begins in 1862, and that cannot happen. They tried to entice the men to re-up by offering them a little money and a month's leave, and not many men did. And Lee said, okay, we're going to do these things. We're not only going to make everybody who isn't in the Army eligible to be in the Army, but all those men who are in the Army and in good faith signed up for a year, good faith, we're going to change the rules on them. That was considered a direct assault on individual freedom and liberty by untold people in the Confederacy. The Confederate government, in effect, had had a contract with those men, argued the men. I agreed to serve for a year, you agreed to do these things, and now you're putting me in service for 2 more years? There's a spike in Confederate desertion in the spring of 1862. that precisely coincides with the passage of this legislation. Lee said, doesn't matter. We need to do this. And in the end, the Confederate people accepted it. And then 2 years later, when those men were eligible to get out again, Confederate Congress changed the rules again. And now they're in for the duration. Here's the bottom line. The Confederacy ever gets you into a uniform, you don't get out. You don't get out. That's something the United States government did not do during the Civil War. If you're from Pennsylvania and you enlist for 9 months, you go home in 9 months. Enlist for a year, you go home in a year. 20,000 soldiers in the Army of the Potomac got out of uniform in the middle of the Overland Campaign in the summer of 1864 because their 3-year enlistments ran out. They went home. That's not an option in the Confederacy. And one of the principal supporters and architects of that policy is R.E. Lee. It's a huge change. It's lost on us now what a sea change of a difference that is in the relationship between the central government and the citizenry. A central government that can force you to risk your life. Lee also supported the central government's right to impress food, animals, and black labor. Confederate government knew that midway through the war, Confederate money had devalued to the degree that it was worthless. Doesn't help to tax people because the money that came in wouldn't be worth anything. So what do you do instead? You take the stuff you need. We need horses, we'll take your horses. We need your mules, we'll take your mules. We need corn, we'll take 10% of your corn crop. We need more labor to build fortifications. We want you to contribute some of your slaves to the national service. Not that the government's going to own them, but that can use their labor for a period of a month or 2 months or 3 months. All of those things Lee supported. During the winter of 1864, he said all the material resources of the country should be marshaled. He knew that this put a tremendous burden on the Confederate people. He was very sensitive to that. He said, we need to do this. We need to make sure that this pain is apportioned fairly and evenly across our population. We have to do it, but we have to try to do it in a fair and even-handed way. He said at that time, in the winter of '64, I think the present law and orders on the subject of impressing things should be so modified as to authorize the government to impress when necessary a certain proportion of everything produced in the country. Everything produced in the country. Government requirements might be heavy, he said. Civilians are going to have to sacrifice. But, and I'll quote him again, if it requires all the meat in the country to support the Army, it should be had. If the Army needs all the meat, nobody else gets meat in the Confederacy. Confederacy's railroads also should be put to the task. Lee said, if we have to, we'll bar civilian traffic on the railroads. If it takes all the railroad traffic to support the armies, then there is no non-military traffic on the railroads. They all get taken over by the government. Whatever is necessary. No civilian passengers, no civilian goods, nothing on the railroads if we need them to support our military effort. Again, that's a step the United States government never even contemplated during the Civil War. The Confederacy is in a desperate fight against long odds. They have to achieve a level of mobilization of resources greater, relatively greater than the United States, human and material resources, and Robert E. Lee says yes, yes, yes. Whatever it takes. Whatever it takes. Late in the war, Lee supported arming some slaves and freeing all who served honorably. You know about this debate that came up. There were people talking a little bit about it earlier in the war. The most famous discussion of it began with Patrick Cleburne in the Army of Tennessee in the winter of 1864, when the Irish-born Cleburne said that you should put slaves into the Confederate Army. It percolated through the rest of the year. Lee, in the spring of '64, told Jefferson Davis, listen, every white man who is doing any job other than carrying a musket in the Army should be given a musket, and that work should be carried out by black men. Not black soldiers, but by slaves or others put to that work. He wanted as many white men as possible carrying muskets. The debate over whether to arm some slaves continued into the fall. Lee didn't say anything. He finally weighed in early 1865, and it's a measure of how important he was that when he weighed in, that pretty much settled the issue. And his argument was this. Has nothing to do with being a closet emancipationist. He said, look, the Yankees are using our slaves against us. If they win the war, they are going to institute emancipation on their terms. They are going to destroy our social system on their terms. We can either do that, or if we can use some slaves in the army and achieve success that way, then we should do it, because if we win the war, we'll still be in control of our social system. This is pure self-interest here that's driving R.E. Lee to a very pragmatic, hard-headed argument that he's making. But he said, you can't get men to risk their lives for nothing. He said, if a slave goes into the army, serves well, you should free him. And you should free his family, and you should let them live where they want to live. In the end, as many of you know, the Confederate Congress, very late in the war, agreed to put some slaves in the army, but did not agree to do any of the other things that Lee said. None of the enticements, if you like, that Lee offered were made part of the law. And it all happened too late to make any difference anyway. It's March 1865 before any of this happened. But my point is that Lee, in the name of Confederate nationhood, was willing even to take this step. As he put it, we must decide whether slavery shall be extinguished by our enemies and the slaves used against us, or use them ourselves at the risk of the effects which may be produced upon our social institutions. If the enrollment of some slaves in the army would bring victory, then the white people of the Confederacy would still be left in charge. That's basically the bottom line of his argument. I'm going to conclude by returning to April 1861, when Lee waited to be ushered into the room where he would accept that commission in Virginia's forces. Virginia was mostly on his mind that day. I don't think there's any doubt about it. But I also think it's very likely. He saw George Washington twice that day. He saw the big equestrian statue of him as he walked toward the Capitol building, the Capitol with an O building, the great equestrian statue that became the centerpiece of the Great Seal of the Confederacy. And then he saw him again, as I said, the famous standing statue just outside the room where the men were meeting. And I don't find it a stretch at all to think that he, at some point that day, thought about George Washington and George Washington's efforts to forge a national resistance from the efforts of 13 sometimes obdurate colonies. That was a crucial task that George Washington had to do, and I think that perhaps Lee the Virginian on that day was already changing his loyalty to Virginia and the South, beginning its transmutation into ardent Confederate purpose. Thanks. I'll just go back. The floor is open now, and I'll repeat your question. There's a hand up already. Yes.
Dr. Gallagher, I want to make sure I heard something correct.
Let's make sure.
You said no black men served in the Confederate military?
No, I said thousands of black men didn't serve in the Confederate military. There are 800,000 or 900,000 soldiers in the Confederate Army, and am I going to stand here and say that never did a black man pick up a musket and fire at Yankees? No, I'm not going to say that, because I think that probably did happen. But were there black Confederate soldiers? I mean, really black Confederate soldiers? My answer to that is no. This idea that they're everywhere and they're serving the Confederacy, no. I just think there's absolutely no evidence to support that.
I have a book at home that addresses that very issue.
I've got a half a shelf of books at home that stress that issue. I just don't buy the evidence.
I think the free blacks did serve voluntarily, maybe in smaller numbers, but I know the Confederate Navy did have a black commissioned officer, and I have the proof at home.
There we go. We could continue that discussion sometime. This isn't the forum, but I will stick to my. There's this, and I know why this argument is out there. This is an attempt retrospectively to get the Confederacy right on race and slavery. And all I can say is just stop, because you can't do it. You can't do it. That doesn't mean all Confederates are monsters. They are living in the mid-19th century. They're coming out of their society and their social background, and they weren't embarrassed by slavery going into the war. We talked about this earlier today. Read Jefferson Davis, read Alexander Stephens, but read them going forward from the late antebellum years into the war. Don't ever bring me anything written after the war to prove that they didn't think slavery was important in the spring of 1861. Just don't even bring it to me. I'm not the least interested in that. I want to know what they said during the secession crisis. I want to know what they said as they're establishing the Confederacy. And I'll save you some time. They're saying slavery is absolutely central. Read the Confederate Constitution. Read the secession documents that come out of the secession conventions in the various southern states. Read Alexander Stephens' cornerstone speech. Read Jefferson Davis's message to Confederate Congress on April 29th, 1861. You cannot read those documents and pretend that slavery is not what's going on. You can't do it. They're not out of their minds. They've got $3 billion worth of wealth at stake. The slaveholders of the South do. They are the wealthiest people in the United States. They control more wealth than anyone else in the United States. We don't think that. The 1860 census tells us that. Property in slaves, $3 billion. All manufacturing interests, all railroads put together in the entire United States, $2.2 billion in 1860. The two wealthiest states per capita in the United States, South Carolina and Mississippi in 1860. What do they have in common? There's a vast amount of wealth at stake. A party has just been elected that doesn't even pretend to be a national party. Doesn't even pretend. Isn't even on the ballot in 10 southern states. Abraham Lincoln is not on the ballot. And slaveholders don't care that the Republican platform in 1860 says we have no designs on slavery where it is, because people know that in 1858, both the new president, in his House Divided speech, and the new Secretary of State, both of them, Secretary of State in his Irrepressible Conflict speech said the United States cannot exist in the long term part slave and part free. It is going to be all of one or all of the other. And slaveholders knew which one they wanted it to be. This is a gamble. This is a gamble on the part of people who control a great deal of wealth and have at stake not only wealth, but control, social control. Lee mentioned it 3 times in the things that I read to you just now. How do you control millions of black people? That is much on the white South's mind. There are no black people virtually in the North. That same 1860 census tells us that the free states were 98.8% white. Now, are white Northerners racist? Of course they are, by our standards. They are. Virtually all Americans, I say virtually, I would say all, but like saying that no black man picked up a musket, you can't say that when so many people are at risk, but virtually all Americans, by our standards, are racist. There's nothing easier than determining that, and nothing more boring to me. Oh, gee, we're better than they are. Okay. That's a very tough hill to climb. Just as we talked about this today, too, in 50 years, people will look at us and think we're unbelievably benighted. I can't believe they did that in 2012. God, they're so backward. Racism is everywhere. Black people are not. And where the black people are, the white people want to have a means of controlling them, and that means of control is the institution of slavery. And that is why all white people, not just slaveholders, have a stake in slavery. Yes, 2/3 of the families in the Confederacy did not own slaves. It does not mean that 2/3 of the families in the Confederacy have no stake in slavery. They absolutely have a stake in slavery. Absolutely. Next question. Yes.
In the PBS program on Lee, it mentioned that he went to, I think it was Scott, and offered to stay in the Army if he didn't have to fight. So if he would have been stationed out west against the Sioux or whatever, he would have stayed in. Can you comment on that?
Who said that? That made it into the PBS Lee?
Yes.
Really?
I believe that's the program I saw.
Okay, well, I was on that program and I watched it once, and I don't remember that, but if it says that, I would say no. No. I mean, how can you guarantee to a soldier that, no. Anyway, I would say no. I could go look maybe.
Scott said he could not guarantee him.
Well, of course he couldn't. No.
Basically said to Lee, you need to make a decision.
Well, Scott did tell him that and hoped he would make a certain decision. Did you have your hand up?
Lee was a very successful general. And
Nicely understated.
during the Civil War, I'm a big fan of the Shelby Foote, the Civil War Ken Burns series, and they talked about Pickett's charge. And Lee, you had to know at that time when you were on the defensive, you were going to come out better.
Now, why did he have to know that? I love this. The people who criticize, and I'm not beating up on you, I'm just using you as a foil. People who like to argue that Lee wasn't a good general, he should have listened to James Longstreet. James Longstreet knew better than Lee because James Longstreet said stand on the defensive. Everybody knew that was the way to win the war. Stand on the... you didn't say Lee wasn't a good general. You just said... You should have said that because of Pickett's charge, you should have understood that you have an advantage if you're on the defensive. Everybody did know that, and James Longstreet told him that at Gettysburg. The notion that that hadn't occurred to Lee, of course, I love to quote Dick Taylor on this. Richard Taylor, who was Zachary Taylor's son, was a Confederate lieutenant general. When someone commented once that Lee should have done what James Longstreet knew something that wasn't apparent to Lee, Dick Taylor said, anyone who knew both of those men would find it odd to think that anything James Longstreet knew would not be apparent to Lee. I mean, Lee had about 50 points of IQ on James Longstreet. I think Longstreet was a very good soldier. Standing on the defensive, my dear friend Alan Nolan, who wrote a book called Lee Considered, which argued against Lee's generalship in many ways, said that the model campaign was Fredericksburg, where you get a great defensive position and the Yankees attack uphill and you slaughter them and then they retreat back across the Rappahannock River. That's a great idea, as long as you have an inexhaustible supply of Ambrose Burnsides on the other side. And that's hard to guarantee, because the very next Union general is Joseph Hooker. And Joseph Hooker got all the way around Lee's flank and should have defeated him at Chancellorsville. Anybody can look up Marye's Heights and decide maybe it's not a great idea to attack up there one brigade at a time all afternoon on December 13th, 1862. I think what Lee understood, what those critics don't understand, is that the key lay with the civilian populations. The war would end when one of the civilian populations said, that's it. We are not going to support this war anymore. Could the Confederacy defeat the Union? Absolutely no. They did not have the resources to do that. But did they have a chance to win the war? Absolutely. This lost cause idea that it was a hopeless effort against insurmountable odds is baloney. That's post-war baloney. The Confederates didn't feel that way during the war. They didn't. They weren't suffering from some mass delusion in 1861 or some idea that let's have a gallant fight and slaughter a quarter of all our military-aged white men just to make a point. No. They were not thinking that way. They thought they could win. Lee believed the key was the civilian population of the United States, and he knew that the fastest way to demoralize the civilian population of the United States was to inflict bloody defeats on Union armies. In order to do that, you shed profligately the blood of the Confederacy too. He's in a race. What's going to happen first? Is the Confederacy going to run out of men? Or is the United States civilian population going to run out of the will to continue the war? That's the question. And Lee is the bloodiest general in American history. Poor Grant. Grant's known as the butcher. Grant's not nearly the butcher Lee is. Not nearly. All those wars out west in that part of the United States we can't really see because it's indistinct and kind of murky. All Grant's great victories out there, Henry and Donelson, Shiloh, Vicksburg, Chattanooga, 35,000 casualties for Grant's forces. 35,000. Lee's casualties in the same period, 95,000. When does Grant get bloody? When he's introduced to R.E. Lee. Same time everybody else gets bloody. You can't be around Lee and not have heaps of casualties. That's just the way it goes. And yet, the 3 times that the Confederacy comes closest to persuading the people of the United States that it wasn't worth it were in the wake of the 7 Days and Second Bull Run, Lee's 2 victories, in the wake of Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, Lee's next 2 victories, and most obviously in the hideous and blood-soaked summer of 1864, when the casualties, even within a Civil War framework, just went off the charts. And the people in the North came this close to saying, that's enough. Abraham Lincoln told his cabinet, we're not going to win the war on August 23rd, 1864. We're not going to be reelected. We have to win the war before the Democrats come in because they won't win it. The Republicans didn't even call themselves Republicans in 1864. They called themselves the Union Party, hoping to attract more support from the Democratic side. Only Philip Sheridan, and I'm going to say it out loud in Atlanta, William Tecumseh Sherman, reelected Abraham Lincoln and the Republicans. And now you have a quick rebuttal, because that was a long response to a question I didn't even let you finish asking. Yeah. Well, that's what Longstreet said, yeah. I think Lee, here's what I think happened at Gettysburg. I think Lee, did Lee know it would fail? Of course he didn't know it would fail. Why would he order an assault he knew would fail? As he said after the battle, now that I know what happened, even as dull a fellow as I am, know that it wasn't the best idea. He knew that. Here's what he thought at Gettysburg. I take Lee at his word. He wrote this to his wife. He wrote this to Jefferson Davis. He simply expected too much from his infantry. He said he asked his infantry to do too much. Why did he do that? Because every other time he'd asked them to do something, they had done it. And I think the most pertinent moment in terms of understanding the 3rd day at Gettysburg, which came on the heels of 2 days, one of which was a spectacular tactical victory for the Army in Northern Virginia, July the 1st, and the second was a day filled with the closest of calls on the Union left, on the Union right, and one Georgia Brigade, Ambrose Wright's, got all the way up to the copse of trees in the Union Center on the late afternoon of July 2nd. With no coordination, they still came close in Lee's view. I think he decided Richard Ewell is vacillating, A.P. Hill has disappeared, James Longstreet is not himself for some reason, Jeb Stuart is off being Jeb Stuart. I'm going to let my infantry take care of this. He had seen it exactly 2 months before, on the 3rd of May, 1863, at Chancellorsville, when his army was divided, with the much more powerful Army of the Potomac in between the pieces, Lee with Lafayette McLaws and Richard Anderson on one side, Jeb Stuart commanding the divisions of Stonewall Jackson on the other side, and through incredibly hard and bitter fighting on the morning of May the 3rd, the wings of the Army of Northern Virginia fought their way together. And in the midst of that success, in Chancellorsville Clearing, R.E. Lee rode down the turnpike / plank road into the midst of his infantry, and there was one of those great epiphanies that took place a few times during the Civil War. The troops went wild when they saw him. There's the old man. There he is. And here we are in victory against the odds. They attacked far more numerous Federals who were behind field works on part of the line, and they succeeded. And they looked at Lee, and Lee looked at them, and I think that is the moment that finished that process of bonding that began in the 7 days and forged this absolutely unshakable bond between Lee and his soldiers. It's unlike any other bond in any other army in the war, it even exceeds that between McClellan and the Army of the Potomac. The men believed Lee could do anything, and Lee believed the men could do anything. And I know that because they both said it. The soldiers' letters are filled with that. They didn't even contemplate the thought of defeat in Pennsylvania. And I think that's what explains Pickett's charge. Lee said it, and I believe him. I think when he rode out among his troops, as Arthur James Lyon Freemantle tells us from his diary and says, "This is all my fault," it was all his fault. And one of his admirable characteristics, it's like Grant, when he did something wrong, he took responsibility for it. He's not Joseph Johnston. He's not George McClellan. The first thing they do is find someone to blame. Can't be me. Can't be me. Must be somebody else. Could be a cabal. People are always plotting against me. That's not the way Lee and Grant handled it. It's all my fault, said Lee. Mine. It was, and he took responsibility, and I think it's because he believed his infantry, as they had at Gaines's Mill, and as they had at Second Bull Run, and as they had at Chancellorsville, would simply take care of things. And he hoped that another Georgian would help, Porter Alexander, with his artillery. He put a little bit too much faith in that pre-assault bombardment. That's another story. Yes?
There was a book a few years ago that said that Gatling gun was a critical element, and that the Lincoln embracing technology helped assist that.
The Gatling gun was a critical element in the Civil War. It was an absolute non-element in the Civil War. It didn't make any difference on any battlefield, in any theater, at any time. Other than that, it was the key. Yes.
What all about the way Lee surrendered? I understand his junior officers wanted to fight a guerrilla war and keep it going.
You're quoting my man Porter Alexander again there. What about the way Lee surrendered? Some of his junior officers wanted him to take to the woods and fight a guerrilla war. Porter Alexander, I'm going to make a little pitch for Porter Alexander here, although I assume most of you have read Porter Alexander. If you haven't, you absolutely should, because he is the most astute observer and analyst of the war who wore a Confederate uniform. Grant is the best on the Union side. Porter Alexander is the best on the Confederate side. And Porter Alexander wrote 2 books. He published one in 1907 called Military Memoirs of a Confederate, but he wrote an earlier one that got, and this is going to sound self-serving, but I'm going to plow ahead. It sort of disappeared in the Southern Historical Collections at Chapel Hill. And I put it back together in the late 1980s. I mean, it was all there. They had just filed it in different files, and so it disappeared. And then I found out how, and in the end, there's a manuscript that goes from page 1 to page 1200. He is the best. He's honest. He wrote the first one that came out later for his children. He had no thought of publishing it, so it's very frank, and he quotes people. He has a great portrait of Lee losing his temper, Lee's humor. He quotes profanity, some of it pretty saucy, from different people. It's an amazing, its analysis of Gettysburg stands up with any analysis that anyone has ever written about Gettysburg. He says that he talked to Lee just before the surrender at Appomattox and says disband the army. And he talks about how Lee talked him out of it. He said it won't do any good. All it'll do is prolong the war, won't change the verdict, and it'll bring destruction to areas that haven't yet experienced it. Lee said essentially the same thing in a letter to Jefferson Davis just a little bit after Appomattox. So I think that what Lee was a realist, I'll say it again. There are no options left at Appomattox after April 9th. Sheridan and some Union infantry have gotten in front of him. George Meade is right behind him. There's nowhere to go. And his army had evaporated. He left Richmond with at least 60,000 men, Richmond and Petersburg, 28,000 signed paroles, probably only 10 or 12,000 actually laid down their arms. The army just melted away during that week of retreat.
This is sort of like a little medical question.
A medical question. Okay. Right.
And that his judgment was flawed. How do you feel about this clouding judgment?
because I'm not a medical person, the question is, did Lee have a heart condition that clouded his judgment at getting that why he behaved the way he did there? And I can't give you a medical opinion about that. The only time I know in the war when we're sure that Lee's health had a real impact was at the North Anna in May of 1864, when he got Grant in a position where Grant's army was on, there's a big loop in the river there, and Grant had troops in 3 different places that couldn't support one another easily, and they were very vulnerable to a counterattack, but Lee was so sick that he couldn't oversee it, and because Longstreet had been shot, and because he didn't trust Ewell or A.P. Hill, there was no way to get at them, and so the opportunity passed. That's the only time I'm sure his health played a role. Could it have at Gettysburg? I suppose it could have, but I think it's important to remember that Lee's behavior at Gettysburg is entirely in character with his behavior throughout the rest of the war. There's nothing odd about what he's doing at Gettysburg. His first urge is always to be aggressive. His first urge, he is as offensive-minded an officer as there is on either side in the war. So could he have been sick? He could have been sick. He had a heart problem in the spring of 1863. He said he felt better by the time of the Gettysburg campaign, but he hadn't been getting much sleep. One of his staff officers said he never got more than 2 hours of sleep in a row, any night during that campaign. And he was in his mid-50s. That didn't used to mean anything to me. I've zoomed past my mid-50s now, and it means something to me. I've seen that torture rack he slept on in the field. Unlike other officers, Lee didn't commandeer the biggest house in the neighborhood to use as his headquarters. He slept in a damn tent on this contraption that's at the Museum of the Confederacy now. I don't see how he did it, so I can't answer that. But I know it's the Lee that's lots of other places. Yes? I know you did. Yes. Well, the question is, the observation that many of you in the audience grew up learning that it was a war between the states and not a war of nations. And all I can say to that is that, I mean, on one level, of course it's a war between the states. There are states in the United States and there are states in the Confederate States. But I think the way to view the Civil War is a war between 2 modern, within a mid-19th century context, nation states. States that certainly had the pretensions. What did the Confederacy want to be? This is one reason why the Confederacy, there are a couple of reasons why it didn't wage a guerrilla war. That's an anachronistic notion about what they should have done. They wanted to be accepted as part of the Western community of nations. How do you do that? You set up a government, you have a regular army, you have a regular navy, you have regular governmental institutions. It walks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, it's a duck. You can't have a real duck if the only army is a bunch of guerrillas. That's not a duck, it's something else. They wanted to be a nation. They considered themselves a nation. And so I think the best way for us to view them is that it's a war between 2 nations, one of which doesn't last very long because unfortunately for it, its entire history was played out in the midst of the greatest war in American history. But it is a nation, and I think the lingering allegiance to it suggests that. I mean, there are the trappings of nationhood that carry on past the point at which there is a nation. The United States gathered the Union dead in national cemeteries. There were no national cemeteries before the Civil War. You need them because you've got 250,000 dead United States soldiers. So you go to the battlefields, you disinter them, and you put them in national cemeteries that just happen to be. I had a student ask me once, why are there so many national cemeteries next to Civil War battlefields? Let's think about that. Hey, there's one at Shiloh. But they don't put the Confederate dead in cemeteries. You don't put Confederate soldiers in United States national cemeteries. So ladies, and there's no Confederate government to do that. That's a job for the central government. There is no central government. So ladies' memorial associations came into being. They oversaw the disinterment and reinterment of the Confederate dead in what amount to Confederate national cemeteries. 30,000 Confederates at Blandford Church in Petersburg, 18,000 in Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, buried by state. There they are, the parts composing the whole. The Tennesseans, the South Carolinians, the North Carolinians in the Confederate cemetery, even at Little Spotsylvania, where they did that. And then you go and have Confederate Memorial Days at that Confederate cemetery. If there's not some notion of nation in place during the Civil War, I would ask what the hell is going on after. Why is there one after the war? Why is there one after the war? It's two nations. I really do think that. It's not, and it's not the North versus the South. 4 southern states stay in the United States. Missouri and Kentucky and Maryland and Delaware are southern states. They're slaveholding states. They stay loyal to the United States. Through the war, Kentucky, I said this afternoon, but it's true, Kentucky became a Confederate state after the war. Because it was so upset with emancipation that it became a Confederate state after the war, and then everybody in Kentucky had been a Confederate, retrospectively. It did get around to ratifying the 13th Amendment, however, in the mid-1970s, so God bless Kentucky. But they're sort of the last ones to that table. It's the United States versus the Confederacy. Everybody doesn't agree with that. No, they don't. And I don't hope to convert everybody, and I have people ask me, why do you say the United States? Why do you refer to the United States? And I say, well, only because it was the United States. They didn't change the name during the war. It's the United States against the Confederacy. One more question? No more questions? 2 more questions. There's one.
It was 1861 again, and you didn't know everything that you know, and Lincoln gave you a commission, and Davis offered you a commission. Who did you fight?
Well, I'm from Los Angeles. So I would peel another orange and say, let me know how it turns out. That's probably what I would do. Yes?
What mistake do you think we made of significance other than Pickett's charge?
Well, I think Lee made a number of mistakes. I think he made a mistake staying north of the Potomac during the Maryland campaign. I think once he lost the gaps in the South Mountain Range, there was absolutely nothing for him to accomplish. He pushed his army past the limit, which he knew. He admitted to Jefferson Davis that between 1/3 and 1/2 of his men had fallen out of the ranks through straggling and desertion and just simply breaking down because they'd outrun their logistical capacity at that point. So what in the world is he hoping to accomplish by fighting the Battle of Antietam? With his back to the Potomac River and only one ford over the river, Bowdler's Ford is it. Bowdler's Ford is it. If something goes wrong on the battlefield at Antietam, the Army of Northern Virginia is toast. And it isn't because he knew George B. McClellan would not push him. That's another bunch of retrospective baloney. The only time I know in the war when we're sure that Lee's health had a real impact was at the North Anna in May of 1864, when he got Grant in a position where Grant's army was on there's a big loop in the river there, and Grant had troops in 3 different places that couldn't support one another easily, and they were very vulnerable to a counterattack. But Lee was so sick that he couldn't oversee it, and because Longstreet had been shot, and because he didn't trust Ewell or A.P. Hill, there was no way to get at them, and so the opportunity passed. That's the only time I'm sure his health played a role. Could it have at Gettysburg? I suppose it could have. But I think it's important to remember that Lee's behavior at Gettysburg is entirely in character with his behavior throughout the rest of the war. There's nothing odd about what he's doing at Gettysburg. His first urge is always to be aggressive. His first urge, he is as offensive-minded an officer as there is on either side in the war. So could he have been sick? He could have been sick. He had a heart problem in the spring of 1864. 1863. He said he felt better by the time of the Gettysburg campaign, but he hadn't been getting much sleep. One of his staff officers said he never got more than 2 hours of sleep in a row any night during that campaign. and he was in his mid-50s. That didn't used to mean anything to me. I've zoomed past my mid-50s now, and it means something to me. I've seen that torture rack he slept on in the field. Unlike other officers, Lee didn't commandeer the biggest house in the neighborhood to use as his headquarters. He slept in a damn tent on this contraption that's at the Museum of the Confederacy now. I don't see how he did it, so I can't answer that. But I know it's the Lee that's lots of other places. Yes?
You talked about the nationalism of the Confederate States. Many of us grew up learning in history that it was not a rebellion.
I know you did.
War between the states.
Yes.
Validity to that.
Well, the question is, the observation that many of you in the audience grew up learning that it was a war between the states and not a war of nations. And all I can say to that is that, on one level, of course it's a war between the states. There are states in the United States and there are states in the Confederate States. But I think the way to view the Civil War is a war between two modern, within a mid-19th century context, nation states. States that certainly had the pretensions. What did the Confederacy want to be? This is one reason why the Confederacy, there are a couple of reasons why it didn't wage a guerrilla war. That's an anachronistic notion about what they should have done. They wanted to be accepted as part of the Western community of nations. How do you do that? You set up a government, you have a regular army, you have a regular navy, you have regular governmental institutions. It walks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, it's a duck. You can't have a real duck if the only army is a bunch of guerrillas. That's not a duck. It's something else. They wanted to be a nation. They considered themselves a nation. And so I think the best way for us to view them is that it's a war between two nations, one of which doesn't last very long because, unfortunately for it, its entire history was played out in the midst of the greatest war in American history. But it is a nation, and I think the lingering allegiance to it suggests that. There are the trappings of nationhood that carry on past the point at which there is a nation. The United States gathered the Union dead in national cemeteries. There were no national cemeteries before the Civil War. You need them because you've got 250,000 dead United States soldiers. So you go to the battlefields, you disinter them, and you put them in national cemeteries that just happen to be. I had a student ask me once, why are there so many national cemeteries next to Civil War battlefields? Let's think about that. Hey, there's one at Shiloh. But they don't put the Confederate dead in cemeteries. You don't put Confederate soldiers in United States national cemeteries. So, ladies, and there's no Confederate government to do that. That's a job for the central government. There is no central government. So, ladies' memorial associations came into being. They oversaw the disinterment and reinterment of the Confederate dead in what amount to Confederate national cemeteries. 30,000 Confederates at Blandford Church in Petersburg, 18,000 in Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, buried by state. There they are, the parts composing the whole. The Tennesseans, the South Carolinians, the North Carolinians in the Confederate cemetery, even at Little Spotsylvania, where they did that. And then you go and have Confederate Memorial Days at that Confederate cemetery. If there's not some notion of nation in place during the Civil War, I would ask what the hell is going on after. Why is there one after the war? Why is there one after the war? It's two nations. I really do think that. It's not the North versus the South. 4 southern states stay in the United States. Missouri and Kentucky and Maryland and Delaware are southern states. They're slaveholding states. They stay loyal to the United States. Through the war, Kentucky, I said this afternoon, but it's true, Kentucky became a Confederate state after the war. Because it was so upset with emancipation that it became a Confederate state after the war, and then everybody in Kentucky had been a Confederate. retrospectively. It did get around to ratifying the 13th Amendment, however, in the mid-1970s, so God bless Kentucky. But they're sort of the last ones to that table. It's the United States versus the Confederacy. Everybody doesn't agree with that. No, they don't. And I don't hope to convert everybody. And I have people ask me, why do you say the United States? Why do you refer to the United States? And I said, well, only because it was the United States. They didn't change the name during the war. It's the United States against the Confederacy. One more question? No more questions? Two more questions. There's one.
It was 1861 again, and you didn't know everything that you know, and Lincoln gave you a commission, and Davis offered you a commission. Who did you fight?
Well, I'm from Los Angeles. So I would peel another orange and say, let me know how it turns out. That's probably what I would do. Yes?
What mistake do you think we made of significance other than Pickett's charge?
Well, I think Lee made a number of mistakes. I think he made a mistake staying north of the Potomac during the Maryland campaign. I think once he lost the gaps in the South Mountain Range, there was absolutely nothing for him to accomplish. He pushed his army past the limit, which he knew. He admitted to Jefferson Davis that between a third and a half of his men had fallen out of the ranks through straggling and desertion and just simply breaking down because they'd outrun their logistical capacity at that point. So what in the world is he hoping to accomplish by fighting the Battle of Antietam? With his back to the Potomac River and only one ford over the river, Bowdler's Ford is it. Bowdler's Ford is it. If something goes wrong on the battlefield at Antietam, the Army of Northern Virginia is toast. And it isn't because he knew George B. McClellan would not push him. That's another bunch of retrospective baloney. We don't know that. He knew George B. McClellan wasn't the most aggressive fellow in the world, but McClellan almost smashed the Army of Northern Virginia on the battlefield at Antietam. It came that close, and there's no way Lee could have known that A.P. Hill, the half of his division that hadn't collapsed, would get up in time to turn the tide late in the day. So I think that's a mistake on his part. I think that one and the third day at Gettysburg are probably the two biggest mistakes. I'm with Porter Alexander. I think Lee should have hunkered down after the first day at Gettysburg, after this spectacular success on the first day, hunker down on Seminary Ridge and say, come and knock me off of this ridge. As Porter Alexander said, they never could have knocked us off. They never knocked us off any ridge. So why didn't we just do that? But that's not Lee. The culture of command in the Army of Northern Virginia just tells us all we need to know about Robert E. Lee. What is it? If you're an officer in the Army of Northern Virginia, what are you encouraged to do? Push. Smash your enemy. Inflict the greatest possible damage. Take risks. Don't give them any respite. Hound them. And Stonewall Jackson's the perfect subordinate for him. Jeb Stuart. Porter Alexander. All of these guys are. What's the culture of command in the Army of the Potomac? It's George B. McClellan's. Every institution has a culture. In the Army of the Potomac, the culture is don't take risks. Don't do anything till everything is ready. Well, most of the people in this audience, maybe you three guys in front, not quite old enough yet to know that in life, nothing is ever perfect. So if you're waiting for things to be perfect to do anything, you've got a long wait because it's never going to happen. That's the culture in the Army of the Potomac. That is not it's just the antithesis of the culture in the Army of Northern Virginia. It's a fascinating comparison of how these different personalities can mold such different sensibilities, if you like, of command and attitude in the two most important armies. With all due respect to the armies that fought at Atlanta, I think the two most important armies in the Civil War, the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia. Thank you very much. You're welcome.